This is the children's shirt, and this is step number 2. Fusible interfacing. We press the interfacing on the wrong side of the collars. You can choose to do the top and the under, or just one of them, but I prefer both. Sometimes you have a little teeny bit of the interfacing coming off the edge, and so I'll neaten it up without cutting the fabric. Just taking a little bit off in case it's hanging over too much. Maybe neaten it up a little here, just a teeny little bit. Okay, let's check out our other piece. That looks good. Probably a little extra fussy, but little extra things like this help you get perfect results. Now let's take the 2 collars, and these are the right sides and the right sides. Okay, we have the wrong side, which has the interfacing on it. And we're going to put our 2 right sides together. And we're going to go ahead and pin. Get the collar tip. And pin at the other collar tip. We'll put a pin in the middle. Divide this space with another pin. Divide this space with another pin. And this is the outer edge. Here's our outer edge, and here's the part we're going to sew to the neckline. So we're going to go ahead and sew this edge with 1/2 inch seam allowance. Go ahead and check it. Let's do a little back stitch. And you remove the pin. Check that our 2 layers are together over here. We have 1/2 inch seam allowance. We can trim both ends. I think I'm going to have to move those back stitches in because we have larger than normal seam allowance on the collar, and we'll trim it. So we're going to go in a little bit farther with our back stitches. That should be sufficient. I went in more like about 3/4 or 7/8. And I think I'll do that with the other end as well. a longer than normal back stitch on both ends, because we're going to end up trimming off some seam allowance. So first off, with this 1/2 inch seam allowance, we're going to trim this down now to 1/4 inch. Feel free to draw this, or if you feel comfortable just eyeballing the quarter, you can do that. You can always take the piece that you cut and pin it or lay it on top for a guide for the rest of it. I'm fine just eyeballing a quarter. That's certainly the quickest way to do it. Now we're going to see which is our under collar and which is our top collar. Well, here we see some notches, 2 notches. That must be the under collar, and then the single notch there, that's the top collar. But these are the same at this point. We're going to make them different. Okay, this is our under collar, and what we're going to do is we're going to push the seam allowance here towards this under collar. Right here I can see my notch and my notch. Okay, here's my under collar. And I'm going to press the seam allowance towards the under collar. So I've pressed the seam allowance towards the under collar. Okay, looks good. Now from the right side of the fabric, we're going to start at the tip of the collar, and we're going to go ahead and make a stitch that is a understitch. After we finish the collar, we won't see this. It'll be on the under collar and it'll be underneath. Let's go forward with a little bit of a back stitch here. Okay, feel free to make that a little bit more than 1/2 inch because we'll be trimming that seam allowance. Go ahead now and do your understitch so you're right next to the seam, but you're on the under collar. Coming towards the end. Let's go ahead and give it a back stitch, a bit longer than 1/2 inch. Let's go ahead and trim our threads. Let's trim threads on the other end. And there is our understitch. It's like an edge stitch. It's on the under collar. Now we're going to go ahead and fold that down so we can't see it, and we're looking at the wrong side on the interfacing side, and we're going to roll that stitch down there, and we're going to work on pinning our ends, securing this with a couple of pins. to rolling down. Let's go to the other end. Roll that stitch down. We're looking at the wrong side, and we are also looking at the under collar. Work on pinning the tip of the collar and the edge. Let's get 3 pins in there. Now we're going to go ahead and sew. Starting with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, we can go ahead and check that. Let's do a little bit of a back stitch. Just 2 to 3 should be fine here. Approaching a pin, let's remove it. We're sewing a 1/2 inch seam allowance. We want to keep this collar rolled with a stitch over it. Give it a little back stitch. Great, that end looks great. Trim those threads nice and close. Let's come to the other end. We're also going to do this with a 1/2 inch. And we're sewing on the under collar side. Make a little adjustment there from where our needle and the seam allowance are, 1/2 inch, the edge of the seam allowance. Let's give it a little back stitch. 2 to 3 should be fine. And we're sewing a 1/2 inch seam allowance down the side of the collar, approaching where the neckline section is going to be, where we're going to sew it into the neckline, ending that seam with a back stitch. 2 to 3 should be sufficient at the ends of both of these seams. And we've trimmed our threads. But now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to trim this seam. Trim this down to 1/4 inch. And then when you get to the corner, you may trim that, leaving 1/8 inch. Let's go to the other end. Let's go ahead and trim first the seam down to 1/4 inch. And then on the corner, leave 1/8 inch, but cut off that corner. Okay? It's not a lot, but you're cutting something off there. It does help to turn the corner around. Now let's go ahead and take that collar, turn the whole thing around, because we're on the wrong side right now. That's why we can see the stitching. This is the under collar with the stitching, the top collar. Let's turn it around and look at the right side of the fabric, because we're looking at the wrong side of the fabric, the interfacing side. And let's take our corner poker and go ahead and gently start to poke the corners. Let's not over poke them. Let's get one, and let's get the other one. Right about there. We don't want to over poke it, and we also want to make sure that they're matching. Let's get back to the other corner. Poke on both sides of that seam allowance in there. And about this time I like to take the two ends together and see if they're looking similar. And I would say so. So I think I'll stop. At this point now I'm going to iron the collar. I'm going to go ahead and iron it on the wrong side where I can see that stitch, that little edge stitch. That little under edge stitch, right? It's an under stitch. I'm not going to see it after we set the collar in. There it is. Press the ends. Now we'll go over to the top collar side. And you can see what's happened is we've pushed some of the fabric out to the top collar side. Like here is our top collar, and we see some under collar pushing through the whole way. So we're going to even that up with a stitch, but that's how we made our top collar larger by rolling over, and we'll trim this later and make our under collar a little bit smaller. But right now I'd like to go ahead and secure this with some pins here at the end. Both ends. Just make sure the seam is rolling. Have this nice and flat. Let's pin this in the middle where our notch is. Then we can divide this section, put a pin, and divide the next section and put a pin. Go ahead and try to sew this with about 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Little back stitch. I'm doing 3/8 inch seam allowance, so I have the edge of the foot here. It's about 1/4, and over here is about 1/8. I'm going to help neaten it up. Coming to the end.